Hi guys, Grand J here and welcome to another one of our videos. Today we'll be talking about the fundamentals of deck building. This is a video that I've been working on for quite a while, and so I'm super excited to be able to show it with you guys. One of the greatest things about the Final Fantasy trading card game is that the game is super balanced and it feels like every archetype is viable to some extent. It just seems that players have to sort of figure out how exactly do they want to build their deck to play off each of the strategies, and today's video we're talking exactly about that. So, this video is about giving you just sort of like the mental outline process of building your own deck. It is a pretty intense video, so you're probably not going to be able to absorb it all up at once, but feel free to rewatch it at some point and to be able to revise and look through it again whenever you're sort of stuck when you're building your own deck. Before we get started, this is a general sort of deck building process and is focused for more intermediate players. So if you're a sort of beginner player, I do recommend you sort of really focus on familiarizing yourself with playing the game and sort of really getting familiar with the game first. Not to say that beginner players can't build their own decks, but I feel it's more important as a beginner player to sort of just get really comfortable with the game, and that way you're able to make sort of better deck building decisions. Next thing, there are exceptions to everything, especially with niche decks. So these are general guidelines, not concrete rules, but in most cases, like 90+% of cases, these strategies or ideas are going to be what's going to help you. So the deck building process I've sort of broken down into sort of like four main categories. So first is the base, then the game plan, extras, then review. So these are the four overarching sort of processes I'm going to be talking about, and each one of these can then be broken up into smaller topics that I'll be sort of going into a little bit more depth about. So getting started is the base. So this is all about getting focused on what your main idea is, the key ideas you're building around before you start, and like fleshing out the other aspects of your deck. So the three components of the base is the core, the focus, and the support. And this is about getting really clear mentally about sort of where you want your deck to go. So the core is the sort of main combo or card or synergy that you want to build your deck around. Usually this is around 1 to 3 cards that you sort of really want to focus on. Some sort of really cool interaction or some sort of way to get value or some sort of really powerful card. And this is like the core of your deck. So here are some examples of like typical cores of certain decks. So one is Alcid plus Rigia slash Onion Knight. So this is the mainstay core for lightning decks for a long time, but it also is a strong core for lightning plus other elements as well. Another core is the starter deck Pain plus Yuna R plus Riku. So this is a way to be able to get out free 7-cost power forwards that also net you cards as well. So the types of cores that are played in different types of decks can be sort of categorized a little bit. So I've got sort of 4 general categorizations of cores here. So we've got value core, and so this is a core that's sort of supposed to get you value or supposed to give you high return on like sort of the cards that you're putting into them. There's greed core, and so these cores tend to be strong finishers, but they do require some sort of setup. Synergy cores are strategies that sort of build around synergies between different sort of cards. Usually they are category-based synergies or job-based synergies. And also restrictive core, and this is where the core of your strategy is a really strong ability, but it does limit deck building processes. A good example of this would be Gilgamesh from set 1 that use Stronger Sword, which really sort of emphasizes you playing pretty much majority backups in your deck. Another restrictive core would be Cleon, which is a monster that prevents both players from playing summons. So yeah, that's like a restrictive core. I'll cover in each one of these cores more differently, and so like certain cores sort of do tend towards certain playstyles, and so yeah, I'll cover these more in a future video. But at this stage, don't worry too much. Figure out what your core sort of cards are, and then you can move on from there. So determining your core is what will help you decide what's necessary in your deck and strategy and what is unneeded or extra. Most of the time when people are building a strategy, they have a core or like a core idea that they want to focus around, but then like because they sort of deviate away from it or they don't stay focused on it, then they start putting in a whole bunch of cards that are sort of unneeded for their deck. One of the greatest examples is a card called No-No. So a lot of players who think if you're playing Win, you want to put No-No into the deck. You really have to sort of focus on your core and then determine whether No-No is a like important part to your strategy and whether it's something extra or whether it's needed. Next is focus. So focus is determining what sort of strategy or path to victory you will take to win the game. So like when you do play your core, what sort of board state does your core leave on the field? Is it an aggressive or defensive play? Is it slow or fast? And in what way does it get you closer to winning? So this is sort of figuring out how does your core win you the game, and getting that really clear in your mind can then help you determine what you need to set up and what you need to play from there on out. So a good way to sort of like look at the Alcid combo as a focus is it removes big forwards from your opponent's field while also playing your own threats at the same time. It's a fast, reactive, and aggressive type of play. So after we sort of figure out this focus, we know we want to play a deck that's reasonably fast, that's aggressive as well. Another example is like the FF10 combo, as we we're talking about. It allows you to create like effectively free pains while reducing water summons. So this is sort of a mid-range or value type strategy where you are able to create resources for free and you're able to sort of draw out a longer value game for yourself. Next, we'll talk about support. So support are cards that are created to support a core's theme. So in general, they're going to be card search, ways to give you guys additional combat stats. Sometimes they increase the potency of some of your effects, and they synergize with your core's theme in general. So some support cards, for example, like if you look at standard unit support, the Warrior Lights, they all support standard units in different ways. Looking at the new Gladiator backup, it allows you to put a free cost standard unit from your break zone back onto the field. Cards like Brian, which allow you to search your standard units. These are all great support cards for a deck that's built around the standard unit core. Next is like elemental support. So if you're playing a specific type of element, you are rewarded for sort of playing those elements. All the free cost backups that give a specific element plus 1000 power, they're great. And yeah, of course, they're supposed to support that archetype. Other cards, for example, can be Leviathan from Opus 3 that increases the power of all water forwards by 2000, or other cards such as Legendary Gabran from Opus 2 that give all your Earth forwards Brave when you're at 6 damage. Moving on, there's additional like other examples of support. You've got like supports that sort of build into a certain type of archetype. So for example, monster support. So for example, Azul, Mira, Gal, these are all cards that support monster type cores. There are summon supports as well. So Legendary Garnet, Star Deck Yuna, Fang, these are like sort of cards that support like sort of a more summon based strategy. So yeah, so determining your core and then like finding support cards for it is really important. Not only that, there's also like plenty of support cards for like character specific situations. So for example, if you're playing Tifa, then you do have Zangan as a support card for that. Cloud is a card that's like notoriously good for having a lot of support. So you have cards like Zac that synergize with Cloud. You have Jesse from the new Opus 4, and you also have like certain other sort of support cards, such as Legendary Aerith that can sort of protect him or does reward you for playing stuff like Cloud. So yeah, so that's what support cards are. Now we're moving on to the game plan. So after we sort of figured out the sort of core or the base of our strategy, now we can start looking into the longer game plan. So the game plan aspect sort of is all about figuring out your overall path from the start of the game to winning. So how do you set up your core and how do you end the game after you get it set up? So there's two components to the gameplay section. We got the setup and we got the follow-up. So these two focus on before and after you play your core. So setup is how you create the board state that you want to play your core in, sort of the time before you play the core, and follow up is what you do like when you want to push for a win after you play a core, or like the time after you play a core. So this is a pretty important balance to take. Because you have a limited card slots in your deck, you have to allocate enough for both, depending on what sort of strategy you are playing. And this is dependent highly upon what your core cards are, and what your focus of your strategy is. And getting this really clear can then help you determine how important the setup is and how important the follow-up is. So if the setup requires more resources, then generally this leaves less slots for the follow-up. It's because you're allocating more cards to setting up your strategy as opposed to following through. So here's a sort of like visual example of like looking at comparatively Alcid versus Final Fantasy X as a setup core follow-up. So Alcid, because it is a reasonably easy deck to set up, you only really need Alcid and then it's like matching free cost forward. The setup for it is really quite cheap. You don't really need any backups. You just got to have two forwards paired up. It's actually really quite easy to set up. You've got plenty of search for both Alcid and like their component cards as well. So we can see that the setup for most Lightning decks or most Lightning Ice decks are usually very low on the setup aspect, and they focus more on the follow-up, which is cards that are good to play after you have your Alcid combo. So that's why Alcid decks, they tend to run cards like Genesis or cards like Armon, which are ways to dull your opponent's forwards after you have your Alcid and you rig it onto the field, allowing you to attack through. Whereas if we look at Final Fantasy X, the setup is longer, and so we have more cards dedicated to setting up. We have cards like Brother that searches for Pain, but we also have cards such as the Rare Pain, which allows you to search for Yuna or Riku. So there are more cards allocated to setup of the core, and so that means that there's less follow-up, or like there's less follow-up required after you do get your setup. On the sort of like complete extreme other end of the spectrum is we have something like a lightning deck that's based around Legendary X-Def. So Legendary X-Def has this really powerful special ability called Grand Cross, where you pay 7 lightning and discard an X-Def, remove all characters from the field other than X-Def, and remove all break zones from the game. So this is a card where if you do trigger off its ability, you are in a very, very good position. You are generally going to be able to win in most circumstances. So in this situation, a lot of the deck is on the setup. You're trying to get to 5 backups. You're trying to get to a point where you have a lot of resources to be able to fuel this. After you get the XF down and you're able to play it, in general, you're going to be in a very good position and you don't need that much support from there on out. So that's why a deck like this doesn't have so much more follow-up. It's a large part of it is just getting the Legendary XF to trigger off its ability. From that point on, you're pretty sweet. And so yeah, if your core requires a long or complicated setup, you do need to reduce your follow-up cards and increase the number of setup cards that you have. If your core is like quick or easy to set up, then you can dedicate more cards to follow-ups. And so yeah, here's a really good balance for determining up whether you use setup cards or follow-up cards. So here are some examples. So Alcid, as I was talking about earlier, in terms of setup, it has cards like Gramis, which searches for Alcid, Devout, which allows you to play Alcid from your break zone if you do discard him, Mog 13 searches for Rigdia, so it searches for older components for Alcid very, very easily. And then for Final Fantasy X, Brother can search for like your Pains, and Pain R can search for Riku or Yuna. So the setup for FF10 is a little bit longer, and so yeah, you generally will dedicate more cards in your deck to the setup. So yeah, so for combo and control decks, setup might be a little bit more complex because sometimes it interact with certain other aspects or certain other resources. So if you're playing a deck that does use break zone type strategies, you're generally going to be using certain effects that can sort of help you put cards into a break zone. Cards like Meryl Whip, Geese, or Moogle are all sort of setup cards that have break zone based strategies. So Water for a long time was playing the legendary card Lena, which allows you to get a 2-cost water forward from your break zone back onto the field. So obviously you want to get those 2-cost water forwards into your break zone. Cards like Geese and Meryl Whip allow you to draw cards and put cards into your break zone. And so these can be setup cards for these sort of strategies. Other cards that can be considered setup cards are, for example, Ephemeral Summoner, which allows you to put a water summon of cost 4 or less on top of your deck. And usually this is used to sort of synergize with EX burst type strategies. So Ephemeral Summoner is considered a setup for Sawyer based strategies. And so yeah, not all setup cards are going to be cards that just like search for cards for your deck. Certain cards can also be just setting up other cards that do require like certain components to be in the right place. Another way to sort of look at it is like Sid Olstein, which is a strategy that's based itself around having a 0-card core. So like basically focusing on getting your opponent's card size, hand size down to 0. So in these sort of situations, like Sid or Olstein or Chaos Wheel might be considered the core of your strategy, and the setup for your strategy can be all those discard effects that sort of reduce your opponent's hand size to 0. Because as soon as you get your opponent's hand size to 0, Sid Olstein and Chaos Wheel both are cards that can just destroy your opponent's forwards without them being able to get any sort of value. So yeah, so these can be considered setups as well for these certain strategies. So also, like sometimes you want to have certain backups ready for to power certain parts of your core effects. So for example, Zangan, he can be considered a setup card if you're basing your strategy around Tifa and Time Mage. So Time Mage from Opus 3, which allows you to remove one of your forwards and put them back into play, which allows you to get the Enter Break Zone ability. So Time Mage can be considered a setup card if you are playing the Genesis Avatar deck. So if you're playing Genesis Avatar, he deals damage to all your opponent's forwards equal to half the power. If you combo that in with a Time Mage, then you get to use that ability twice during the turn, and you're able to finish off your opponent's forwards. So Time Mage can be considered a part of the setup for a Genesis Avatar based strategy. Follow-up. So follow-up is what you do after you hit your core. So like, what are strong finishes that can be used as like straight after you play your core to close out the game? Or what are cards that sort of help you get over the sort of final challenges you might face after you do get your core down. So after you get your core down, what are ways that you can close out the game, or what are ways that can push you through? So cards for Acid combo, for example, use cards like Red Mage, which haste your forwards for damage. So if you do get your Acid combo and you do have the extra CP to spare, you can always use Red Mage to haste your forwards to speed up this aggressive play process. Another card is Shiva, especially for the Lightning Ice variant of the strategy, which dulls two opposing forwards, and this is one of the strongest sort of like follow-up cards that Ice has. Basically, if your opponent has only 2 forwards, Shiva allows all your forwards to attack through in like most cases. So it's an extremely strong card, and that's why a lot of situations Ice decks, if they play a Shiva, they generally win on that turn. So yeah, it's a really strong follow-through card. Another card would be Odin 4, so it removes problem blockers such as Warrior Light or Ash or Guy, those sort of cards. So yeah, these are follow-up cards. These are cards that help you close out a game after you do play a core. The Final Fantasy X combo, it has certain follow-ups such as the starter deck Valor 4, which allows Pain to be able to trade against bigger forwards, and also because you have a strategy that builds backups, it allows you to sort of reactivate your backups and get additional value out of that as well. Famfrit allows you to sacrifice your Pains, and it also gets value from the Yuna backup as well. And yeah, cards like Waka or Cecil buff up your forwards to get over larger forwards, and these are follow-up cards to allow you to get over your opponent's resistance. Do know that sort of like different types of decks and colors have certain sort of follow-up cards that are limited to them. So not all decks can play Shiva as a follow-up card. Water and Wind tend to have to like fight their way through, and so yeah, stuff like Waka, stuff like Cecil buffs your guys so they can get over your opponent's forwards. So yeah, so if you're having trouble closing out games after you play your core, you need more effective follow-up cards, or just more follow-up cards. So cards that will help you close out a game after you get your core out. If you're struggling to get the pieces together or quickly or in sort of efficient sort of setup, then you need more setup cards. So these cards are going to help you be able to search for certain pieces or certain cards that can help you like draw into those pieces as soon as possible. And so like these are little things that you can determine after you do some playtesting. If you're having trouble finishing a game or if you're having trouble setting up, then yeah, these are extra cards that you want to allocate more slots into your deck for. Now we talk about the third component, which I consider like the extra component to your deck. So the main strategy is set, and now we're looking at the sort of other cards that can be used to sort of flesh out your strategy or help you deal with certain challenges. And so as a part of the extra component, there's 2 components to that. So there's synergy and text. So synergy cards are cards that sort of don't directly support your core, but are very high value or powerful when you play around your core. So they may not have a effect that directly focuses on your focus, but they're generally high value. So in a lot of cases, it's like worth playing them. So typically they're cards with sort of name or category benefits, and also sort of effects that sort of sync up really well with your core. So for example, Locke here, he's a Final Fantasy VI character. Now, if you're building a Final Fantasy VI strategy that focuses around, say, Dadaluma's effect, or if you're building a Final Fantasy VI strategy that focuses around like Terra, or something that's more sort of a freeze focus with like Celis, Locke does not directly contribute to those strategies, right? So it's not a part of the focus of the deck, but his synergy value is just really high. So as a 3-cost forward at 7,000 power, he's like on curve, but also he's got the ability to just make your opponent discard a card straight from their hand, and also he's a very deadly attacker as well. So certain cards like this just have so much synergy, or bring so much value to the table that you don't really need particularly core out in order to play these guys to get like huge sort of ability. That being said, they are sort of extras, so we only consider them after we sort of get the main core of the strategy out. So some examples for synergy cards is like in the Acid combo, we have cards like Black Mage. And so this is a backup that allows you to destroy a forward that has received damage. And this synergizes really well with all the like sort of Acid components. Final Fantasy X has like starter deck Valor 4, which is like, it technically is a pretty weak summon that only deals 3,000 damage to all your opponent's forwards. But with Yuna on the field, it does cost 0 or less CP. So effectively, you do use it and you reactivate all your backups, and so that's really good. There's plenty of value for it. It helps your forwards to trade up, and it also, if you hit it as an EX burst, just reactivates all your backups. So there's plenty of really good synergistic value there. So the card is just straight up strong. And because it sort of synergizes really well in the deck, you can just chuck it in very easily. Other like cards that synergize with, obviously Water Summon synergize with Yuna because they all get a reduction in their cost. Legendary Tidus and Legendary Bart are also cards that synergize with this sort of strategy because you're able to put up forwards really quickly and very cheaply. They sort of really synergize with forwards that do get more power with the more forwards you have on the field. So yeah, moving on to techs. So these are the final few cards that sort of help you deal with certain matchups or certain cards. They don't need to synergize with the core of your strategy, but should be powerful in the given matchups. So some tech examples. So in the Alcid combo sort of deck, Black Mage, like from Opus 3, it destroys a 3-cost forward of So here's some examples for text for these combos. So for Alcid, one of the biggest challenges that the deck faces is a forward called Ash. It is a forward that gets additional power every time it's chosen, and also it's got the ability to reactivate itself an infinite number of times. So Black Mage from Opus 3 is a really good tech against it. Although it is expensive, it's one of the few backups that specifically is able to deal with her without any sort of requirements. Another card is Black Mage from Opus 2 that reduces a forward's power by 4,000, and this helps the Lightning deck deal with water decks when Minwu's on the field, because you're unable to kill a forward if you're dealing damage that's less than their full power, and reducing their power allows you to lower that threshold, so all your like packet damage type effects are enough to just sort of lethal them out in one go. Some texts that Final Fantasy X might have is, for example, Legendary Aerith, which is a backup that prevents your forwards from being chosen by your opponent's backups, and this can be really relevant in certain matchups. Previously, it was really good against Earth and Fire because Fire couldn't use Red Mage to make your guys unable to block, and Earth's EX burst with Mustadio and Raoban couldn't hit your forwards. Another great tech was for Minwu, and this is a really potent ability, especially against the Lightning and Fire decks, where your forwards don't receive damage that is less than their power. So ping type strategies that like Fire and Lightning have, they all become negated while Minwu's on the field. And so yeah, this is a really powerful card in a certain matchup, and that's why you consider these tech cards. They don't necessarily always fit into your strategy, but their effect is just so relevant and so strong in certain matchups. That's why we put them in. And that's the sort of extra cards that we sort of look at. Now we look at the final component, which is reviewing. And this is probably the most important aspect of sort of deck building. So we got the bulk of the deck sorted out. Now it's time to just make some changes and adjustments to sort of really refine the deck. So out of the review section, there's balance, cuts, test, and repeat. Now, balance is where we sort of have a look at the list overall and what we have and see if there are certain cards that we might be short on. And then we sort of add them in. So they're like sort of three major considerations that we have in this sort of part of our deck building. Backups, do we have enough? Generally, like if we sort of like tunnel vision onto building sort of a certain strategy, we'll have a whole bunch of summons or a whole bunch of forwards in the like deck, but we don't have enough backups. And this is where we start adding a couple of backups that sort of get us up to a certain number. In terms of backups, like the really good number that I found is like 17 or 18. Depending on your strategy, sometimes you might go like as high as 20 or as low as like 15 or 16. But those are sort of like more niche sort of cases. Another consideration is the forward cost. You have like too many forwards that are high costed or too many forwards that are low costed. So if you have too many forwards, or like, let's say like half your forwards are like 4-cost forwards, you may find yourself being in a situation where it becomes really expensive for you to play your forwards out because you are like expending a lot of resources to play those forwards. Maybe you start considering having some lower cost forwards to sort of balance it out. Another consideration is elements. So like, are you using like too few of one of your elements? So if you are using a 2-element deck and you might have realized that, hey, you have like 15 of your backups are one color, or a majority of your forwards are a certain color, and you sort of like want to balance out some of those numbers, that might be relevant as well. So these are considerations for balance. You might want to sort of up or down certain numbers depending on like what sort of looks about right. Next, we look at cuts. So at this stage, we've definitely gone over 50 cards. Don't worry, this is all a part of the process. So cuts is where we sort of look at the list as we got it, and this is where we selectively decide which cards sort of don't make the cut or which cards we have to remove to get us down to that 50 card threshold. So things to consider when you're sort of making cuts from your deck is like, you're asking yourself, do you really need like 3 copies of this card, or do you need like X copies of this card? Do you like need to play it multiple times during the game, or like having 1 or 2 is enough? Now this is a like whole topic within itself, and so yeah, don't worry if you're not sure about whether having 1 or 3 cards is sort of enough. I will make a follow-up video where we do flesh out like this idea as well. Another thing to ask is like, do these like synergy or tech cards help me win games? So yeah, like you might have a card that's like really good synergy or like has a lot of value, but if it's not needed in the deck because let's say if there's a certain card that synergizes well with your deck because it brings a lot of removal to the table, but your deck already has so much more removal, maybe that synergy isn't required. Same with tech cards. Like if you have a strategy that's really good against ice, for example, let's say if you're playing a strategy that has wind and earth and you have a lot of cards that can reactivate your forwards, do you really need a card like Guy to tech against ice matchups? Because your deck is already such a good winner against this sort of matchup. Do you need these tech cards to help you win those matchups even more? Maybe it might be better to cut some of them or like to use other techs instead. You're looking at whether every one of your support cards is necessary. Now, there is like a situation where you might have too many support cards, and like looking back at the sort of gameplay aspect of deck building, if you don't need so many support cards because your deck can set it up reasonably quickly or reasonably efficiently, then maybe you don't need so many support cards. And so, yes, like sort of taking into consideration that balance is relevant as well. And also another consideration is how many times do you expect to play this card in this game? So do you necessarily need to have all 3 copies of this card? Because maybe if you play it once or twice, the game is pretty much over, or you only need them in like very specific situations. So these are questions that you can sort of consider whether to determine what cards you want to be cutting as you're sort of trying to get yourself down to 50 cards. Next is testing. So we've sort of theorized a certain strategy and built a deck around it, but maybe we haven't sort of gone the right way about it. Play some games to see how the deck runs and keep sort of track of any issues that you notice. So yeah, like at the best of times, even if you do build a deck that's like well balanced, that's got a game plan and everything, but maybe there's certain flaws to the deck that we haven't sort of really figured out yet. So things to consider when you're testing is your deck bricking, or like are there situations where you're just unable to play stuff due to your cards being too high cost, or you aren't able to get your element colors combined very well, so there's not enough of each element, or maybe you're not drawing to enough backups. These sort of things, keep them in mind, and then we can adjust for them later. Another question to look at is, are you always discarding certain cards? So if you're always discarding certain cards, do you really need that card for the deck, or do you really need so many copies of that card for the deck? And that's another sort of like thing to take into consideration. And also, did you get wrecked by a certain card? And this is really important because this helps you determine to find a tech to deal with certain cards that sort of really wreck you in certain matchups. For example, Guy is a forward that can't be dulled by your opponent's card effects, so it is the card that every ice deck that has to deal with it. Every ice deck has to tech against it. They have to figure out a solution if they do face this forward. How they get over it, because if they can't get over it, they just lose, right? So you need to find a tech. Yeah, for example, Lightning and Fire, they also need to find a tech to deal with Legendary Cecil, especially right now in the metagame. Legendary Cecil seeing more play. They have to find a way to be able to get rid of it, and because Legendary Cecil can't receive damage from abilities or summons, these sort of decks have to work out alternative ways to get around them, and that's where you sort of look back at your tech cards and see what you sort of need to deal with very specific matchups. And the final part is repeat. So decks are never really perfect on your first try. Even the best top deck builders are adjusting things all the time. So you're never going to get it right on your first shot. And that is all part of the process, so don't worry about it. Don't get discouraged. Try the process again with a slightly different approach. Maybe look at different support cards. Maybe look at the setup and look at the follow-up again. Maybe look at some of your extras. These are all things that you can sort of like tweak and adjust. So yeah, don't get discouraged. Work on it, and yeah, you'll like be able to improve all the time. And finally, yeah, just doing a quick little review. So I know it's been like a pretty intense sort of video, and there's a whole bunch of ideas that we can sort of flesh out even more. I'll do like follow-up videos for sure to sort of really go deep into some of these aspects. But like today's video is more about an overall sense of like how to build your deck. And so yeah, so to review, first of all, you look at your base, which is like all about focusing on an idea. So you look at the core cards that you want to build your deck around, then you sort of focus on what the strategy is going to be, and you add support cards. Next is your game plan. So this is sort of where you flesh out your deck, and this is sort of where you build your strategy. So you look at your setup and your follow-up. How much setup do you need? How much follow-up you need? And you sort of allocate your balance there. Next is extras, and so these are the sort of additional tools that your deck will use in certain matchups or to be able to push itself forward. And so there are synergy cards that are really great value and tech cards that help you deal with certain matchups. And finally, review, which is sort of where you fill your gaps and adjust to make sure your deck is working all right. And so yeah, here we look at balance, cuts, we do testing, and then we repeat. And this is the overall deck building process. So yeah, it's a lot to sort of go through. So don't worry if you don't get it all in one go. So yeah, each one of these parts we can dissect into a lot deeper, and I'll do follow-up videos on each of them. Yeah, definitely refer back to this video whenever you sort of like need help to like sort of whenever you need help to sort of work on your deck. And also practice just helps you with your fluency. So the more you sort of work on decks, the more familiar you are going to be with this process. When you do it for a long time, you do get really fluent and really familiar. And that's why like when I'm working on decks on stream, I've sort of got this process like in my mind. I've done it so many times before that we can look at a list, we can figure out what the components are, and we sort of build from there. And so yeah, practice makes perfect. The more you do it, the more familiar you get, and the faster you'll be able to do it in future. So I do have some worked examples. So I've done a ton of these during my Twitch streams. I will be like sifting through some of those Twitch streams, finding out some of the really good examples of like where we've found a sort of core idea and we sort of built a deck around it, and we can sort of follow the process of that. So check in the video description. I will have them out, fingers crossed, by the end of the week. So they may not be in the video description now, but if you're watching this video after it's been uploaded, say like for longer than a week, there should be a link in the description where you can see some worked examples of when we sort of build decks, and sort of like the key thought process that we have when we sort of work on them. Finally, if you have any questions, do feel free to shoot them through to me in the comments below or via Twitter. Yeah, let me know if there's any specific area you want me to go more in depth on. Yeah, I take on feedback, and sort of like they give me sort of ideas for what sort of future videos to make. So let me know what you want, and I'll be able to sort of create more content for you guys that are more relevant for you guys. And thanks a lot for watching. So definitely feel free to post any questions or feedback you have in the comments. If you enjoy my content, please feel free to subscribe and thumbs up the video. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm, and with the recent YouTube apocalypse. Now has never been a better time to sort of help me. So if you haven't subscribed and haven't thumbs up, I really would appreciate the support. Also, I do stream like games of Final Fantasy TCG regularly during the week from Sunday to Thursday. May not always be Final Fantasy that's happening on the stream, but here are the general times. And yeah, so like pop on in if you have questions for deck building, or if you just want to sort of hang out and chat and talk about cards, then that's a great time to pop in and do so. But thanks a lot for watching. Hope you guys found this video enjoyable and informative. Grand J out.